right, welcome back, everyone, to another episode of the Autism Podcast. You guys know the drill by now. Before we get started with today's episode, be sure to check out our website, www.londonautismgroupcharity.org, where you can find exclusive information about our services such as volunteering and our community cafes that are hosted all across London, that are hosted by the founders, James Gordon and Chris Papadopoulos. You don't have to sign up. You don't have to pay anything. It doesn't cost nothing. You literally just come in, have a tea or coffee, be amongst other autistic people. If you are autistic, if you're not autistic and you would like to attend, you can also do so. It's not exclusive to autistic people. If you're not autistic and you just want to learn more about autism, there are plenty of opportunities to do so. You can also talk to the founders themselves about the charity and their services as well and get more information there. And for autistic people, it's just a great place to just be yourself. And of course, we are your hosts, Simeon Thompson, and I've got my co-host with me, Dr. Sophia Christophi, who's also in the building today. How's it going, Sophia?
All good, thanks, Simeon. I'm looking forward to interviewing our guest today. And also, just to add that we are now on Instagram. So please do follow us there. You will see new episode updates, guest highlights, and behind the scenes, inspiring quotes and community stories, all about autism acceptance and advocacy.
Yep, all of that information will be in the description below, so please be sure to check this out after today's episode. But anyway, on to today's special guest, who hopes to raise the voices of autistic people, provide safe learning spaces, information, and signposting to the autistic community. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the stage, the founder of Pandas Online. We have Nic King. How's it going?
Thanks. So, I'm Nic. I am the owner and founder of Pandas Online. I am the creator of NeuroBears, which is, in some age groups, the only course for autistic young people. So, the NeuroBears course is the only course for them. I also have a younger person's course, which is also the only one exists. And I now have a teenager to young adult course called Unpacking Understanding. There are more teen courses out there. I also have a research paper that's the largest collection of autistic children's voice in 120-year history. I'm autistic, I'm ADHD, I'm dyslexic. I have a background in charity before I created Pandas Online. I'm a parent. I have an older teen and a younger child, and have a thing for pandas and aerial and musical theatre.
Amazing, impressive list of things there. I thought it might be helpful for you to share a little bit more about your journey into uncovering your neurodivergence, how that came about, your diagnoses, so the audience can get to know you a little bit better.
Okay, so the dyslexia one, and bear in mind I am old, I am over 40. I was born in the different century, as my teenager quite, likes to remind me on the regular. So I was in primary school in the 80s and secondary school in the 90s. Okay, that's where we were. The dyslexia was sort of picked up quite early on. I was diagnosed dyslexic sort of before, well, it was my late teens still, but at the time it was a bag. They would never have associated the word autism with me in the 90s, ever. However, I was sort of noticed to be different. I didn't go to school full time. By the time I was in the third year of secondary school, I only went part time. I was given lots of structure to my non-structured times. So I think they saw something, but they would never have associated the word autism with it. And for quite a long time, I didn't necessarily think I was autistic. I have a lot of male family members who fit a stereotype. And somebody has to fit the stereotype, and they are serving the stereotype heavily. And in the late 90s, early 2000s, that's kind of what I thought autistic people were. I think it was sort of maybe somewhere in the 2010s that I started to use the word neurodivergent and started to think about that. At this point, I actually can't remember where I got diagnosed. It was fairly recently. It was in the last five, sort of 6, 7, a few years ago. And my ADHD one even more recently than that because I had some probably unhealthy coping strategies around really large amounts of coffee until that didn't work for me anymore. And I needed to go get some actual ADHD medication. So yeah, I had a family history of people who knew they were different, and I had quite a neuro-affirming upbringing that we would call it now. So yeah, like a lot of people who are, the other side of 40, it did not happen in childhood, but it was never going to either.
Right. So would you say that because you not only are autistic but also have got ADHD and dyslexia, would you say that those three things in combination made things a lot more difficult for you growing up?
So I think there was definitely a narrative where I was not trying hard enough, that I had the ability to do better had I just, I don't know, done something about it. That it was sort of within my sphere of control that I could have done better. But actually, it was really difficult. We're talking about a sort of time where I didn't, my coursework for my GCSEs was handwritten. And the dyslexia was not serving that at all. And I think that there were lots of aspects of my education that could have been vastly different had I been diagnosed. And I think those feelings of feeling different, feeling that you weren't like other people, and being sort of it was clear that I wasn't like other people, but I wasn't particularly that into like hiding who I was. I was still quite unapologetically myself, but that did mean that I was really badly bullied in school. But I internalized that as a sort of like I am the problem. And I think maybe if I'd known that wouldn't have happened as much, like that internalization, the bullying probably still would have happened, but like, how I felt about it might have been different.
Yeah, I think we discussed on a previous episode with another guest around the whole kind of internalized ableism and how everybody's expectations of you and what you should be doing and what you should be achieving sometimes become internalized, and we end up kind of taking it out on ourselves when actually we're just trying to do the best we can in the situation. It is nice to hear that you had quite a neuro-affirming upbringing, though, despite not having any diagnoses. I think that can be quite a challenging time for parents when their child undiagnosed. They're perhaps not sure how to help or how to support, but it sounds like putting structure in place for those unstructured times, it was identified as being a need. And so it was something that was addressed, which is, yeah, quite, I think, quite unusual to hear, actually.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
100%. You definitely don't hear that a lot, even in today's standards. So back then in the 90s, that was practically unheard of, so it's definitely something that I'm glad you had that kind of support during the times when you weren't diagnosed to kind of help with your autistic identity. It's definitely something that is a great think story to hear, and it does let a lot of people know who are listening to this that it's definitely possible to understand yourself, get that kind of support even when that support is not available in the current climate. It seems if you have the right support at home, it does make the difference when it comes to accepting yourself and understanding yourself.
I think what it also shows is that actually, if there are strategies that might be helpful for a young person, but they don't have a diagnosis yet, then it's still worth exploring them and still worth trying those. I know sometimes when I speak to parents of undiagnosed children, they're kind of like, "Oh, I'm not sure. They might be autistic, they might be ADHD, they might be a combination. I don't really know where to begin." And I always say that if you try something that is kind of traditionally works really well for an autistic person or traditionally works really well for an ADHD and it works for your child, then that's absolutely fine. They don't have to have the diagnosis for you to use those strategies. They're not kind of exclusive to us as such.
I often talk about it as my privilege, and I do think it gave me a huge amount of privilege. The fact that my noise sensitivity was never questioned in my home, and like requests around like not rustling a newspaper when I was doing my homework was never met with no. And also like my food sensitivities, I apparently was allowed to eat like just chicken and cucumber and a jacket potato with a spoon well into, being 8, 9, 10. Which again, you're talking about sort of like the late 80s, early 90s, and that was not a standard type of parenting at the time. And I do think it is one of the huge privileges I have had that I try and kind of pass forward, because actually this generation coming through, this generation of children is possibly going to be the last generation through where their parents didn't know they were neurodivergent.
If I'm honest, yeah, I would agree because the fact that there's more and more people nowadays that are minus Sophia's age that are coming out as autistic and were autistic all along, even from the previous generations as well. Yeah, it's definitely something that I 100% agree with. I do believe there's going to be a lot more autistic people that is going to be born as autistic from the beginning, and it's just something that it just gives a message out there to the non-autistic people who are the naysayers that look, we're here to stay. There's no one, we're not going anywhere. We're not dying out. We're not a disease. We're not any of that stupid stuff that, or a lot of those narratives that have been put on us for so many decades. We are human beings at the end of the day. We exist just as much as you. We function just as much as you. We just don't act and operate the same way that non-autistic people do. But that doesn't make us less human. What I want to go into with the next question, I would say, Nick, is what can you tell me about Pandas Online and how did that come about?
I think there is a blurb that somebody else wrote for me that is probably going to be better than what I'm about to say, but then I'll probably do it afterwards. Pandas Online exists because I got really, really annoyed of nobody else doing it, so I decided to do it myself. And that is fundamentally it. I sat in a research project which was all about like the autism diagnosis pathway. And I sat in this national project, NHS England. You were in all the meetings with all, the high ups and stuff like that. And I kind of went in it, and I think it was 2017, full of hope that we were going to have some sort of change in the system in a very naive kind of way. And midway through, I realized that was actually never, ever going to happen, and not even close to what, if I had a magic wand, could happen. And I have a background in charity. Before I started Pandas Online, I'd run sort of autistic, neurodivergent charities for normally young people, normally youths. There was obviously always an element of family support, but it was normally about the young people. And in 2020, we were running a course with Kieran Rose, the autistic advocate. We were running the inside of autism for my charity. And obviously lockdown happened, and we put that group of people online. And then after that, we put the next group of people online. And then we had a 250 people waiting list, and we put the next group of people online. And throughout that process, throughout sort of delivering Inside of Autism, there should be a children's version of this course. And that was really easy to see because that is a very long program that is very much an 18 plus material. And I had a very random moment one day where I woke up and said, I can explain autism with bears. And Kieran Rose and my eldest child and my partner all thought I'd absolutely lost my marbles. And I sat down, and essentially the core bit of NeuroBears came out of me within sort of a roughly 48-hour period. And fundamentally, you could still look at that bit of paper and see NeuroBears in it. And that was sort of where it went. I feel incredibly passionately that I don't understand why we're diagnosing this generation if we are not telling them what it is to be autistic, and absolutely outside of the deficit model that they are diagnosed in, if we are not giving them a community of autistic elders that look, I don't know, feasible. I think that I see posts about, Simone Biles, and these Olympians or people who've won Oscars who are, autistic and neurodivergent. But realistically, there are a lot of us out there just being adults and vaguely adulting quite well. And quite a lot of us aren't going to win Oscars or win Olympic gold medals because that is a tiny percentage of the population. And I just sort of I wanted to create space where young people could understand their neurology, not even necessarily in a positive framework, just in a neutral one. Just in a sort of this is how it is, this is how you are, and you can figure yourself out. And if you figure yourself out, you'll probably be well on the road to being all right. And yeah, that's kind of where it happened. There's a story about why it's a panda if you want it, but maybe we'll do the first bit first.
No, no, go ahead and talk about it if it's related to the story. That's the whole point of this
And
conversation.
the whole point of the bit. Okay, so I've always had a thing for pandas. I've always had pandas knocking around my house. And I don't know, do you have a visual on this podcast? I
Uh,
had this
we
panda.
don't, but but that's fine.
But we'll have it. You can have it for fun. So we'll describe it. It is like a mascot type head of a panda that you can put over your head, and I would if it wasn't 25 degrees in my room. And one day, Mr. Kieran Rose was being particularly demand avoidant because I am not demanding, obviously, clearly. It's not entirely true. And he sent me a gif of a panda, like sort of waving its arms in a slightly irritated way. And the next meeting I had with him, I showed up with a panda head on. And then the pandas became sort of like a thing. It became how we sort of communicated. So when we were sort of talking about making NeuroBears, I think it always had to be a panda. And then there was research into other bears. One of the reasons there's other reasons that it's a panda, other than it brings me absolute joy, and it does. Like, because I think if I'm doing something 40 hours a week, it should be bringing me joy because it's not always easy. So, like, pandas can get really fussy about their specific types of bamboo. Like they can go through like a brand of bamboo and then completely change their mind and need another one. I also really like the fact that they do handstands and we up trees to communicate with each other. And then polar bear is a polar bear because polar bears aren't white. Polar bears have black skin and their fur isn't even white, it's translucent and it reflects the environment that they're in. And I use polar bear to talk about the observational model and how we do a lot of observing autistic young people, particularly. And then we have brown bear, who brown bears don't tend to get put in zoos and they can thrive in many different types of environment and generally they're all right. And they often, and brown bear represents the neurotypical people. So there you go. There's my bears. Yeah, autistic.
Comes with the territory,
I
isn't
was going to say, yeah, I love the level of research that's gone into looking at the different bears. I feel like that's a very neurodivergent thing, and it's very pleasing to hear.
I mean, I was just taking note, especially with when you mentioned about the polar bears not actually having white fur. It's actually they have black skin and everything, which something I found out say about 5 years ago when I was watching the chase one day. In that sense, it's I would say the polar bear having that particular thing is kind of how I see it is as like perception of autistic people in a sense because obviously from the outside it looks like they have white fur and no one will ever know but beneath the surface who that person is as a person the same way that most people don't know that the polar bear has black skin under the white fur which is like you said a reflection of the environment. So that's actually genuinely a good analogy when it comes to explaining autistic people and explaining how they function to a non-autistic person, for example, or even just to another autistic person who doesn't have much understanding of autism when it comes to them. So one thing I wanted to find out in that sense is pandas, the name, is that an acronym for anything, or or is it just called Pandas Online?
It is, but mainly because I wanted it to be pandas and forced an acronym into it. So it is something that I probably should be able to remember off the top of my head.
No,
Promoting acceptance of neurodivergence and support. There we go. It went in eventually.
no, that's
Yeah.
a great title, but obviously your love for pandas was the main inspiration for that, I'm guessing, was it?
Yeah, I have a very like I had a really strong memory of my grandparents going to China, which was probably in the late 80s to early 90s, and bringing back a video and I mean a product of its time. They'd been into a panda enclosure to hug baby pandas. And I just have like this really strong memory of it. I have a really strong memory of them talking about like how they felt different and stuff like that. And I think it's just always like it's always been an animal that's been knocking about in my life, if you know what I mean. But yeah, it was about when I did this, about a feeling of creating a safe space that I just wanted to continue.
Yeah, and I think that's really needed, particularly for children and young people. And there has always been a big gap there in terms of having information that is directed at them and for them. Do you ever get any kind of feedback from children and young people around what the course has meant to them or how they feel afterwards? Because I also agree with you when you said that, even if we could just get to a neutral position, that would be great because for so long it's been negative based. And I think lots of young autistic people feel very negative about the diagnosis initially as well. So to go from that negative experience to embracing it as a positive part of your identity is a really big jump. But aiming for a neutral explanation seems perfect to me. So I just wondered if you could share any kind of feedback that you get around the course and what it's doing for children and young people.
Okay, so we have put NeuroBears through research. It's on a pre-publish. I'm still having a bit of an issue around peer reviewing and word counts. However, we did research with 134 young people. So it wasn't a small data set, just choices were made. And so we got good feedback in that like they enjoyed it in terms of like a percentage, it was over 70% that said that like they enjoyed it more than a moderate amount, that they liked it. I get a lot of things like they like sitting like it created a space to talk about being autistic, that it created a moment to like talk to the adult about their own experiences. We get a lot of feedback about that it gives them a language to talk about like their own experience, because if we're going back to thinking about polar bear, these young people are observed. They're observed constantly, and assumptions are made about how they're experiencing the world. And sometimes, you know, we could just give them the language and then ask them. Like that's a crazy idea. But it's actually not. And then sort of the research, it was I think it was something like 98% of them really cared that it was made by autistic people, with some good quotes about like, that only autistic people should really be talking about autism, and that, it was good to see people doing things health like and helping people, and then loads of feedback about sort of like understanding themselves and feeling less alone and understanding co-occurring conditions. It's lovely. There is another aspect of it that's less lovely when you ask them about things that they find difficult that isn't about neurobears, but
It does sound like it's having a real impact, and as I said earlier, it's a much needed space for children and young people. And often when I work with autistic children and young people too, the thing that they always say is how much they enjoy being in a room with other people, other neurodivergent people. And that's something that's come up really frequently. And it makes sense. Of course, you're going to like being in a room with people who get it, where you don't have to mask, where you can be yourself.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think it's amazing stuff, and I'm pleased that this sort of thing exists now because it certainly wasn't around when I was younger or for either of you either.
Nope. And to add to that as well, the fact that not only is it a good start when it comes to, you know, autistic children and understanding themselves, of course, this goes with the message that I keep on saying every single time on every episode, which is learning to understand yourself. Because look what happens when you do. I mean, again, I'm not going to go into it because I think I've said it enough times, but NeuroBears is a perfect example of exactly what can be done to help autistic people learn about themselves and understand themselves. And because they're doing it from a young age, from when they're children, they have a much better chance of, you know, accepting themselves and no longer having this sort of thing of internalized ableism or anything like that. You know, I remember one of our previous guests, Jenny Lochran from the Autistic Revolution, she asked a very important question about what would it be like for an autistic person to grow up without trauma. And I definitely think that if people go to places like NeuroBears to kind of have that understanding, if their child is non-autistic, sorry, if their child is autistic and the parent is non-autistic, sorry, I got mixed up there. And that's a great way to for that trauma to be avoided because of course they are being accepted from the beginning. They are learning about themselves from the beginning. As soon as they find out they're autistic, or even if they have suspicions of being autistic because of the way that they act around others and stuff like that, that trauma won't be there. And once again, when you have that understanding of yourself, the confidence that comes with it, it's just inevitable. So even when you get those kind of negative moments where you might be stigmatized or you might be misunderstood or you might be judged for just being different, it's like water off a duck's back. It does nothing to you, because you realize within yourself, you know your value within yourself, and the fact that the people that support you and value you for who you are. So the people who don't value you for who you are, you're just like, "Pfft, you guys are just irrelevant to that. That's kind of how it is. So I'm really glad as well that something like NeuroBears exists, and this is something that we 100% need as autistic people. I just wanted to find out from you, Nick, is NeuroBears only for children or is it and young people? Is it for adults as well, or is it what's the demographic for this?
So there's three courses now. So there's NeuroBear Cubs that's meant to be roughly under 8. It's very short, it's animated, it's very cute. You use the word autism, we talk about sensory systems and things like that. It is just a very early start of a conversation about like what do you think about your brain? Like what do you think your brain's good at? What do you think your brain struggles with? Can we sort of slightly think about that in a very, very simple way? And then we've sort of pitched NeuroBears at, we say 8 to 14. I think there is an element where it's too much for some 8-year-olds and it's a bit simple for some 14-year-olds, but it's difficult to put an age on things because you can have 14-year-olds that were diagnosed yesterday and you can have 14-year-olds that were diagnosed 10 years ago. So there is a bit of a sort of thing with age. What in an ideal world, if I had it, everyone would have done NeuroBears within sort of 1 to 2 years of self-identifying. So NeuroBears is sort of at that age group. It's an hour and a half. It's got lots and lots of sort of information in it. It's got 12 videos. It's got a lot of workbooks and a lot of structure around it. And a huge amount of information. It's got more information than some adult courses. And then the new one for 14 plus. So I've said sort of 14 to young adult is probably where it's sitting, is huge. It's 20 hours long. Should have stopped recording at some point. With 29 other neurodivergent adults, professionals in it. And I would say it covers everything. It doesn't cover everything. I probably could have kept going. But it covers a lot. And it covers a lot in depth. And it's a lot of conversations that I was just fundamentally like, what do we need to tell them? What do we need to tell them that nobody else is telling them? So there's everything from basic information in there about sort of like monotropism and the double empathy problem and communicating in relationships and how you can manage different types of relationships now that you're sort of going out into the world on your own, to like some really random videos about like what you could think about if you are autistic and hypermobile and having an intimate relationship. So like it's got a lot in there. I've kind of covered age groups now. What I do say, because I license NeuroBears and Cubs to organisations, and then one of the things that I say is that I don't like it. I don't mind it shown to children and adults, and obviously family units do children and their parents, but I don't think any of it is just for adults. When I do train adults myself, I do it in a different way. I don't necessarily don't use my pandas, but I think particularly NeuroBears, can get patronising for adults. People think it's cute for 10 minutes, but like there is a level where I am speaking to younger people, and I'm speaking to younger people how you should speak to younger people, which is not necessarily how you should speak to adults and professionals. It's a different kind of sort of tone. So not for adults, but I do also call it Trojan Panda training, in that we do actually secretly train the adults in the room as well. But it's not for them. There's plenty of adult training out there.
What I want to find out then is what would you say are your future plans for NeuroBears and Pandas Online in general?
Take over the world, Pinky in the Brain, something like that. Okay, if I had a magic wand, I would have hubs across the country running with autistic adults presenting NeuroBears to groups of roughly 6 children and their parents reasonably soon after their self-identification or diagnosis, and I would do that up and down the country. NeuroBears is licensed. There are some places where it is actually used post-diagnosis in like small pockets because NHS England has a policy against post-diagnosis support for children. But there's small pockets knocking around where it does happen. There's quite a lot of schools that have got licenses. It's licensed a lot in Ireland because they actually have a post-diagnosis policy. Randomly, it's licensed in Orkney. All the young people in Orkney are getting NeuroBears. And then like there's pockets sort of throughout the country. So there's a local charity up here that they have a contract with NHS to do post-diagnosis support, and they use NeuroBears to do it. And then it's licensed internationally as well, but obviously outside the UK it tends to be within a private structure outside of Ireland. But yeah, if I had a magic wand, it would be in little hubs where young people shortly after the self-identification would just come and experience it together in a group. Something some of my license holders do, you know how you talked about getting groups of kids together because they're lush together. A few of my license holders actually run post NeuroBears like community groups. So the kids go and do NeuroBears, they make relationships, and then they facilitate a group of kids that have done NeuroBears like after the course, and they still see each other. And I love that. I love that so much. There is no pressure to do that because I can't pressurize people to do that. But I love it when they do.
So they
Yeah,
end up
that's
finding actual friendships during that point? Fair enough. That's a great message. Sorry, Sophia, I didn't mean to cut you off there. What were you going to say?
That's all right. Do you think there is anything that can be done to help support non-autistic children better understand autistic children, particularly in kind of school environment? What would your top tips be in terms of making a classroom more neuro-inclusive, neuro-affirming?
Fundamentally, the research shows that when neurotypes don't necessarily get along well, that we don't necessarily work well together, that we're not always going to gel, that we are going to make thin slice judgments against each other that are not necessarily going to be inherently positive. I think there is lots and lots and lots of room to reduce the narratives on autistic children, that we are preparing them for adulthood by teaching them neurotypical socialization, that we are preparing them for adult by forcing them to do teamwork, that we are preparing them for adulthood by sort of ideas around compliance, and going against then inherent sort of needs in their sensory systems and things like that. There was a point, and I've currently taken it off, there was a point where I had a version of NeuroBears in a license holder account that was aimed, it was 20 minutes long, and it was aimed at the other peers. I think I put it up for Autism Acceptance Month in 2022. But that is also the problem. Not only it was probably problematic that I did it for Autism Acceptance Month, but I also realised that was probably the only time that a school would show other students. And like there was ideas and tips around support and acceptance and like an understanding of how, we communicate differently within the double empathy problem, and that we might have some very deep interests, and how, they might not understand sort of very monotropic thought. Fundamentally, I think whilst we have a compliance-based, rigid, ironically, extremely rigid, we're meant to be the diagnostically rigid ones, it isn't necessarily going to be cohesive for lots of different neurotypes being together in a small space. I also don't think it's particularly natural for you to think that your friendship group should be based on people who are within a year of your birth and 5 miles of your home, because that's not what my friendship groups look like.
Yeah, I think that's fair and a really important point as well. I really struggled with friendships at school, and it was predominantly because I was surrounded by people my own age all the time, and I never felt like I had something that I could connect with. So it wasn't really until I went to university and I met some mature students and people that were older than me that I started to find people who I felt like I could talk to and relate to more. So yeah, school's really difficult when the pressure is to make friends with these people because they're in your class and they're going to be in your class for the rest of the year, and that's just how it is.
I remember you saying this before, Sophia, in the previous episode. I think you said this with David, I believe. And I just wanted to find out, just would you say that was due to age or was that due to mindset? That you had more communication and you had more connections with people in university because of the fact that they were more older? Would you think it was due to age or due to mindset and understanding?
Probably a bit of both. So when I was at school, I was undiagnosed autistic, so I didn't exactly have a great understanding of myself at that time. But then also the people that were the same age as me had completely different interests to me. And I think that was different at university because the mature students, the older students, they were there because they really wanted to do the course. And that's why I was there too. I didn't have an interest in going out at the weekends or drinking or any of the social events. So I found it really hard to be amongst a big group of 18-year-olds who were away from home for the first time and couldn't wait to basically party the academic year away. When what I really wanted to do was talk to someone about statistics and the course and what we were studying. And I only found that in the older students. And obviously by that point, going to university, I also did have my diagnosis and I'd learned a lot more about myself. So probably a combination of the two.
Yeah, I mean, you kind of highlighted it exactly what I was looking for, which was the interests were correlating because obviously when you're 18 and in uni, that's all most students want to do. They just want to go out and party and turn up every night. And that's something that is obviously was uninteresting to you. I mean, I can relate because I hate it too. I can't stand clubs. But that's exactly what, if anything, I want to kind of give a tip towards is to anyone who is struggling to make friends. I said this in the last episode with Katie Monday as well. Autistic people find it a lot easier to connect with people who also have the same interest or a similar interest in what they're interested in. And it really does prove because another misconception that a lot of non-autistics like to make about us is the fact that we don't know how to socialize and we don't know how to talk. And I guarantee you, if you speak to someone who has the same interests as you, trust me, they're going to be talking for hours. You know, that's just how we are. We like to info dump. So the second we find out, like, for example, I'm a big fan of music. I listen to many different types of genres from multiple eras and languages and stuff like that. If I find out someone else likes music as much as I do, yeah, I don't stop talking, and neither does that person as well. So we're able to have that kind of conversation because we also have that deep interest in it. And I guess that's what you're trying to come up with as well, Sophia, is the fact that I guess a lot of people you within your age group at the time wasn't interested in statistics and stuff like that. So that's the reason why you found it a lot harder to make friends within your own age group because that's the type of stuff that they find boring in quotations.
Yeah.
And and I'm pretty sure you must have gotten that same kind of stigma of being boring because you weren't the one. Oh my God, why weren't you going out? You should be living life and getting wasted and everything. And no, but obviously it's not boring. It's just different interests. But would you say that's what it was for you?
I think there's also another misconception, and I don't know, Nick, if you notice this particularly with the children and young people, that people assume that we don't want to make friends, that we we just want to be on our own all the time. And sometimes that is true. Sometimes I do want my own company, and that's fine. But actually, lots of autistic people do want to connect with others, but we rarely have the opportunity to meet others we can connect with.
Oh yeah.
And I think that's just completely misinterpreted as us not wanting friends. Lots of autistic young people, children that I work with, very much do want friends, but it's trying to navigate that situation that they find challenging, particularly if they don't get many opportunities to meet other neurodivergent people.
It's something interesting enough that I had to deep dive into a data for because we had a bit of a rebuttal at peer review about talking about autistic people feeling lonely, like the young autistic people feeling lonely. And I had to go and do a deep dive into sort of like particularly the sort of just the word capture that we had because I was like, I'm sure I read that and I read that and I read that. And in the end I found sort of roughly 15% of the young people in the data that we got back were using the word lonely or alone. And then there was on top of that sort of more data around sort of feelings that you would associate or word structures that you would associate with feeling alone. And I think a lot of them, I don't know, everyone wants a connection, don't they? You want somebody that you can connect with. Sometimes friendships have a lot of pressure to them. They have pressure to sort of communicate and stay in touch and spend emotional or physical energy putting stuff into it that if you are in a difficult situation, maybe you're in sort of burnout or you're really, really struggling, that can be difficult to give. But I think everyone wants connection. I actually have more of a difficulty with the word friend than I do anything else. I think it sort of it suggests a level of relationship, and it's not necessarily that simple. I have people who I consider my friends who I've never met in person, and I talk to them all the time, all the time, but I've never met them. And then obviously there is a layer on top of that when you're talking about young people as adults, particularly those of us on AOL Instant Messenger in the 90s. It wasn't a good vibe, people. We as adults we have the fear of our children being online and having sort of like online friendships that as autistic adults we have, because often they're based around our interests, and often if you've got some very niche interests as a young person, and I'd probably say statistics could be within a niche interest for a young person, although my eldest did do a statistics GCSE as well. You're going to have to sort of cast your net further to try and find people with a similar sort of interest as you, but then there is a layer where there are adults sort of on top of you being like, don't talk to strangers on the internet, and it just gets a bit complicated. Can I ask you something? Did people say that you had an old soul?
Yes. Yes, all the time. It was, she's very mature for her age, or she's like an adult in a child's body, all of those kind of things.
I
Yeah.
had
Was you asking just Sophia or asking me as well?
I think it was because of how Sophia was talking about sort of like that, being around older people and that sort of idea around that they behaved like they weren't going out clubbing. But did they say that about you as well? Did they?
No, it was more with me. It was more like he's so quiet a lot of the time. Why he must be very shy and stuff. But then whenever I did speak, they did learn stuff. Like, because a lot of the time anytime I did talk about stuff, it's always about stuff that I was interested in, and I was called intelligent a lot, growing up by, say, my dad's friends, especially. And my dad used to always say to me, he was in front of my friends that, he's a very intelligent kid, for his age as well. So I didn't get the old soul comment, but I definitely got the whole, I guess I got the same kind of you're quite mature for your age sort of thing.
Mm.
Because most people, the things I was talking about a lot when I was growing up, most kids didn't really talk about. So
Yeah, I can relate to that. I was often, whilst all the kind of children were running around and screaming and stuff, I'd be sat at the table with the adults and just quietly listening to their conversations and kind of taking it all in. Yeah, I used to get the quiet as well, quiet, shy, reserved, introverted. But actually, I was quite happy just being in their presence and being in that kind of situation where it wasn't too chaotic and unpredictable, which I found kind of playground settings to be. I was talking to my brother recently actually about in primary school, if you were really well behaved on a Friday, you got an extra playtime. And I used to frequently get this extra playtime, but I hated it because I never knew what to do with this unstructured time. And whilst everyone else was kind of running up and down and making loads of noise, I'd be sat somewhere with my book, and then people would make comments about me reading in the playground and stuff. But it kind of made me laugh that from a neurotypical perspective, having an extra break, an extra playtime is like a really good thing. It's a reward. And I used to sit there and think, please don't give me the extra playtime, please don't give me the extra playtime, because navigating the two playtimes was bad enough. So I would have been quite happy to be inside with some structure and routine rather than being in that sort of unpredictable situation.
Yeah, it was a different experience to me, I would say, because I actually kind of liked the playtime. But the difference was is that because I didn't have much friends back in, especially in primary school, I would always play by myself, but outside in the playground, because obviously there was a point where no one wanted to play with me. But then, so I kind of found my own company a lot of the time. But the few times when I was around the other kids, yeah, I also enjoyed that too. But I guess I never really had that kind of felt the need to be inside during those break times. But obviously everyone's experience is different, which is exactly what we're trying to promote here. Not everyone's experience is the exact same.
Yeah, and I think Nick, you mentioned earlier about when you were growing up, you were quite unapologetically yourself. And I think that's another way where we've had quite different experiences because I would say that I was someone that actually masked quite a lot and felt like I had to mask because that was the only way to kind of survive social situations. So I wondered if you could kind of tell us a little bit more about that experience of just being you and what do you think were the reasons that allowed you to not put on that mask? And do you still feel that way now, or have you masked more as you've got older?
Okay. So I think nobody has ever described me as shy or quiet. Let's start there. I do not have shy or quiet or introverted in me. It is not there. And that isn't necessarily something that's desperately positive. I mean, obviously I've made a living off it, but I could definitely do with like talking less and smiling more quite often. I think it's school, and I don't know if it's because I had a household and a family of people who were also, they wouldn't have used the word autistic to talk about themselves, but they knew they were incredibly different and they'd structured a life around them that worked for them. And I think that was modeled in a lot of ways. I often took my grandfather, who I did live with when I was young, we did multi-generational household, had sheds, and his shed was full of his specialist interests. There was a phone system, an analog phone system that he had stolen from a hospital after the war and put in an analog phone system throughout of our house because my grandmother was physically disabled, so couldn't easily ring him and make him make a cup of tea for her. And then that also went to our neighbours' houses as well because I don't know, because he fancied doing it. I also had an alarm system that had 6 switches that turned it on and off, and only he understood our electricity. And now, we have garden sheds full of our specialist interests. We have garden office, and it's the same thing. And I think, so partly, I think it was because I had home that was a very sort of safe and neurodivergent affirming place. And it sort of almost didn't occur to me that I should be trying to be different to who I was and how I was, particularly when I was young. I think that did become clearer when you go into sort of like secondary school and, teenage years. I just wasn't very good at it. And I kind of sort of possibly just didn't have the emotional or physical energy to spend on that level of masking that I would have had to have done. Don't get me wrong, I have a level where I have a mask. I have a work mask that I often, because my first job was at Disney, I often talk like how I have quite a Disney professional sort of front in that it's sort of a bit sort of like happy, chirpy, and slightly American. I've yet to point at anyone. But actually having not having very good masks hasn't always been beneficial. It can be to my detriment. There can be feedback on me that I am difficult. It depends who you are. It tends to be local authorities and or people who interact with my children, you know? And that's fine. I've never been very good at being employed.
Those sound like perfectly good situations to be difficult in. And we are very glad to have you on this show and for you to be exactly who you are. So, yeah, interesting that only certain places find would use the label difficult. That's seems to happen quite a lot. There's a lot of parent shaming, I think, that I've noticed as well in my role. So much parent shaming, so much parent blame when actually parents are just trying to do the best for their autistic child or their neurodivergent child. And instead of that being met with support and kindness, it's met with labels like you're difficult, you're an over anxious mother, you're this, you're that. But yes, so I'm sorry that you've experienced that.
It just comes down to the classic judgments and stigma towards autistic people, isn't it? It's just anytime that, you don't act a certain way, you're always seen as difficult or too much or intense or, all the other shaming buzz terms that like to be put on us. Anytime I hear this, it's just like, okay, yeah, just another one. I'm not even shocked anymore whenever I hear it. It's just because it's just going to happen, unfortunately. But one thing I will want to point out is the fact that you're probably the first guest ever that we've had on the show that has not had a masking experience. And and that's a good thing, because it's definitely a breath of fresh air to speak to someone who is autistic. And just like you said in the beginning, it was unapologetically yourself. And it's definitely something that is 100% needs to be encouraged and something that I always like to encourage, what Sophia likes to encourage all the time. It's about just being yourself. It's just the fact that even when you are being yourself and it's seen as difficult in quotation marks and stuff, I think in fact what I said earlier about when you get criticized, when you get these kind of stigmas and stuff, it's just water off a duck's back. You're literally a shining example of what I just said. And it's exactly goes to show you again, proof right here, listeners, of what happens when you understand yourself. And one thing I want to find out, just continuing on from the neuro-affirming learning that happened with when you were growing up, would you say that's what kind of fueled your devotion and passion towards creating NeuroBears and Pandas Online? And did your children have any part of, also creating that because you didn't have also your children didn't have that growing up, so you wanted to create this community?
So there is a very clear family neurodivergent tree ahead of me. So we had the grandfather who had some very niche interests around electricity. And, he did some crazy things because he was old enough to be putting like the first layers of electricity in to like historic buildings in the northeast. And then if we go a little bit further back from that, I am directly related to George Stephenson, who created trains. He was born a mile that way down the road. And I've often sort of joked that there is nothing much more autistic than making trains. And then my father and my uncle had some very devoted monotropism to swimming and went on to Team GB. And I have a long line of people who have followed their interests. And there was a little bit of like pressure with that because I was obviously quite an intelligent young person. And it was always going to be, you're going to change the world. And I actually spent quite a lot of my 20s thinking I was a complete failure because I hadn't. I'm slightly over it. So I think, that I've talked about that being my privilege a lot in various platforms. And I think if you have privilege, you can share. that with people. You can give as much of you can of that to people. And I think it is probably, I'm not saying I'm sitting here as a non-traumatized autistic person because that is inaccurate for a start, but like I don't think, we can live in these systems and be untraumatized. But I've probably got less than quite a lot of us. And that is something that we can share. As for my young people, my eldest is now 16, and they benefited from having parents who were diagnosed before they were, which isn't necessarily the experience of most 16-year-olds in 2025. They often were diagnosed and then their parents figure it out. So they had a different experience in that, my husband was diagnosed before they were born, and I knew. And by the time we got round to having the 8-year-old, nine as of a few weeks back, I knew they were autistic when they were a baby. By 4 months old, I was like, yeah, well, clearly, very clearly. So they have been brought up like they were autistic from day dot. They got their diagnosis as soon as they possibly could, but obviously there's still a timeline to that. My eldest is involved in NeuroBears. My eldest now works for me, but they've been involved in NeuroBears since the start, and they've had their own advocacy company and have done public speaking and international conferences since 2020, since they were 11. They actually have a national award for volunteering and making a difference in inclusion in science centres. So they're really passionate about that. My youngest uses the information and the privilege that they have of being my child to make professionals' life difficult, which I love and appreciate on a very fundamental level. They recently went to a meeting on their own with an educational psychologist with an 8-page suggested training document for their new TA.
I hope you guys were listening to that because that is definitely something that that if I'm honest with you, that's just a great story. It really is. Like, especially Jenny Lockyer, and I hope you're listening to this because it's the answer to your question was just answered there. That is someone who has both parents of autistic children, and they had the advantage of growing up as autistic and being exposed to other autistics. It's I'm honest, man. I'm really happy to hear that your children, had, parents like yourself and your husband to really teach your children exactly what it is to be autistic. So they never had the struggle of trying to figure it out from, just from the world. Because, of course, we know, I'm pretty sure you know this, that there's tons and tons of autistic people who still struggle to this day to just live, because they don't have that kind of support. They don't have that kind of family, who really supported them. So it's just a great story to hear when someone does have that kind of support from yourself growing up, and then it's passed on to your children as well. So that generational trauma isn't even there. It doesn't exist. And I believe once, going back to what you said before about how the current generation is probably going to be the last generation where, they don't know that they're autistic. I really hope that that will be the start of, the autism stigma disappearing because more people will get used to growing up autistic and supported. Like myself, for example, when I have children, Sophia, when she has children, well, if you want to have children, that is, that would be the advantage. Because I know for a fact when I have children, because I have a much better understanding of myself now, I'm a lot more confident in my abilities. I know who I am, and autism is a part of my identity. Just for context for yourself, Nick, I used to hate myself for being autistic. In fact, when I got diagnosed at 14, I denied it for a whole decade. It was only around 23 that's when I kind of accepted it. But then the funny part is, after that point, I saw it as a crutch. I didn't see it as, it was only until literally last year, the end of last year, by the way, where I really started to not only accept it, but embrace it and, understand myself for being autistic, and that's what's given me this confidence. So yeah, when I do have children, that won't happen to my child either. So, it's just going back to you, it's just I'm just so happy that your children had that experience. So they never really had to experience that kind of trauma. Because me and Sophia, we both know what that's like to have that trauma, have that shame, have that internalized ableism on us, you know? So it's just a great story. I don't know if you wanted to say something, Sophia.
Yeah, I think it's going to be really interesting to see how things change over time, particularly as autistic parents are having autistic children, and that diagnosis is known much earlier on and it's normalized within households, and it's just going to be a completely different way of growing up. And it sounds like a really positive experience too. Now all we need to do is kind of get education on board, workplaces on board. So actually maybe your children, Nick, will be the next generation in changing the world. It sounds like you've made a start and they're joining you on that journey too.
I often joke, and I joke that my eldest will change the world and my youngest will control it. They are very different human beings. But no, don't get me wrong. They have still suffered from being in systems that are not suitable. School, my eldest came out in 2020. They hadn't done any of secondary school. They've been educated at home, and I probably should have taken them out sooner. My youngest, I don't know, they might be getting near the end of their sort of in-school education journey. And, we still have to live within systems. Just this week, I messaged a school to ask if I could have a visit, and it's a mainstream school. And I got an email saying they weren't accepting any more children with EHCPs for that year group. Now, that's completely illegal and it's discriminatory, but also I am not putting ourselves into a situation where the first answer I'd had out of somebody was illegal and within discrimination. So our household is fairly awesome, but we are still having to sort of survive wider systems as a family, possibly as quite a loud, difficult family who give feedback.
If I'm honest, the difficult ones is the ones that make change. So I don't see that as a negative,
I agree.
because that's exactly what will make change. Because I've mentioned this many times before. I believe it's like a strength in numbers. The more people that come out and, go against the system, that's what creates change within the system. Because if everyone was passive and just kind of accepted it, things was to stay the same 50 years from now. I mean, if that was the case, then all the things that's changed just in the last 50 years alone wouldn't even happen. The fact that, for example, the LGBT community wouldn't even be a thing. The increase in gay marriages and interracial marriages, I was meant to say, wouldn't exist. Those happened because of the quote unquote difficult people who made the change. So I don't see that as a negative at all. I've been called difficult and I'm doing part of the same thing of trying to make a change.
It's a comparison I often make because obviously in the 60s, homosexuality was in the DSM. It was a medical condition that you could be diagnosed with, and it was still illegal to be gay in 1972. And within my personal story, my dad is gay, and he was born in 1958, and he did the correct thing, and he married a woman and had a child. And bizarrely, if it hadn't been illegal, I probably wouldn't exist. However, you know, he came out in the 80s. He's now has a husband, he is married, and I think there is a historical sort of, crossover between our communities that we can talk about in that, we're being listed within the DSM, and there can be changes to form around identity, there can be changes in law to support us. But also as well, I think, I remember going to Pride in the early 90s and it was very, very different. And it was a different experience for quite a long time because quite a lot of the older generation died from AIDS. And actually, what we need to be thinking about giving our young autistic people is that community that the LGBTQ plus community have now, in that they have a lot of older people in the community who are there to support, to sort of mentor, to give their experience, to sort of promote and advocate for change. And actually, if you think about our community's at an earlier starting point of that, but I think there are huge comparisons and similarities to have and lessons to learn from there as well.
Fair enough. I mean, Nick, that's a great analogy and a great comparison to just to highlight what needs to still needs to be done and what happens. And it's great that your dad came out and, to be himself, which is again what your whole family is about. It seems like you've had this pattern, growing up just through generations, it seems. So I'm really happy that, there's one example that I've heard that from their parents to their grandparents, you've all had that kind of synchronized family where you're all thinking the same, you all have that kind of support, you all have that kind of acceptance, and it's just amazing. It's just amazing. And I think more people should take note of what happens. If you are a parent that has an autistic child, please support that child. Don't look down on them. It's not gonna help the child at all. But before we end the episode, I like to ask this question to all the guests. We already know one of them anyway, but so I wanted to find out what are some of your other special interests. I know that one of them is bears, and you spent quite a bit of time talking about that. But do you have any other special interests that you would like to share, or?
I mean, I have a few. Obviously, I do a huge amount of autism type research and always have, and I've always had quite an interest in sort of like social justice, lots of social justice model. I did my dissertation on, the failure of feminism as a movement. However, what I'm going to tell you is musical theatre. Lots and lots of theatre, huge amounts of theatre. Currently Hamilton's in our local theatre, and I've been 6 times in the last fortnight. And one of the current cast members was on the original German cast recording, so I have also been listening to Hamilton in German this week.
Fair
But
enough.
yeah, we did 55 shows last year.
Wow. So you
Yeah.
went to all 55 Hamilton shows?
No, no, not 55 Hamilton shows, just 55 sort of musical and or theatre shows.
Oh, right, right,
I
right.
do
Okay.
mix it up. It's not just Hamilton. It
Okay.
just because I do love Hamilton and it's currently only sort of half an hour, 40-minute drive away, as opposed to in London, which is a lot nearer, 3 to 4 hours away, and a train fare.
Fair
I
enough.
did also think that you had seen Hamilton 55 times, so I interpreted that a little bit literally as well.
Sorry.
Um, but I'm pleased that you get so much enjoyment from seeing Hamilton in the theatre or going to the theatre. I know you mentioned earlier that trying to arrange this podcast date around Hamilton date was a really important thing as well. So yeah, it sounds like it's a really special interest for you. And yeah, we love hearing the interests that our guests have and how passionate people are about their interests as well.
It's very diverse. Very
Yeah,
diverse. It's
very.
always something different, which is what I like to spread. All right. If that's the case, then Nick, thank you very much for coming onto the show today. It's been an absolute pleasure meeting you and hearing your story. Again, another shining example of what the autistic community needs to hear. Definitely, it was a very beautiful story that you have, having that just that family dynamic where everyone supports each other, and especially because they possess the same thing. Everyone is autistic in some way. So there's always been that support. There's never been that stigma, or there's never been that, let's just say, not fitting in or anything like that, it seems, from yourself or anyone else in your family. And it's definitely a step in the right direction. And I do hope that future families who are autistic will have the same kind of experiences, because that will, in my opinion, actually, I don't think it's an opinion now. I believe it will definitely be a fact that they won't be traumatized. They won't have that kind of feeling alone and not knowing where to belong and feeling misunderstood and feeling judged. None of that would happen. You know, if more families were like yours, with that are all autistic, this whole thing about masking, burnout, well, I'm pretty sure this will be burnout, but you know, all that other stuff just won't be a thing. You know, so it's been great having you on the show today, 100%.
We will link in the description. We'll have links to Pandas Online, NeuroBears, any other information that you'd like to provide us so that our listeners can get in contact with you and stay updated with what you're doing. So thank you again for joining us.
Thank you.
And guys, remember, well, first of all, please check out NeuroBears if you are a parent that has an autistic child. Please check out NeuroBears. It will 100% make a huge difference for your child. Your child will benefit from it greatly. And just to everybody else who's listening today, remember, as autistic people, we're not here to fit into the box that was made for us by non-autistics. We are here to take them out of their boxes so they can learn and understand about us. You know, it's up to them if they want to do it, but I would say it's up to you, the listener, to understand yourself and understand your potential, because that's exactly where it lies. It lies within you, not externally. Please stop looking to other people to understand you. Understand yourself. If you do that, life will be a lot better for you. Thank you, Nic, for coming on the show today once again. It's been an absolute pleasure. And remember, everyone, stay blessed and keep expanding.